At 18, Natalie Jane Martin had just stepped over the line that separates before from after. High school was finished. The routines that once defined her days, bells, homework, weekend shifts, small-town gossip, were loosening their grip. Ahead of her was a future that still felt wide open: college, work, travel, new friends, new love, new versions of herself she hadn't met yet. In that space between endings and beginnings, Natalie did what many young people do. She went on a trip with friends to celebrate graduation: Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, promised sun and music, and the sense of freedom that comes when you're finally allowed to be out late without permission. It was meant to be a bright, loud marker of change, but the most important change had already happened before any suitcase was packed. Natalie had ended a relationship. For years she had dated Blake William Lincas, a boy from her community in Ohio. They were the kind of couple people expected to last because they had lasted so long already. They shared friends, memories, and the invisible social glue that forms when two teenagers grow up side by side. To outsiders, it looked like normal young love. Inside the relationship, though, normality began to blur. Friends later described jealousy that didn't pass quickly, questions that weren't casual, a need to know where she was, who she was with, what she was doing, why she hadn't answered fast enough. The behavior wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, almost polite, concern dressed up as devotion. The problem with control is that it often arrives disguised as care. Natalie broke up with Blake in early 2023. The exact words spoken between them aren't preserved like evidence. What remains is the fact that she chose separation. She chose autonomy. She chose a life that didn't have to orbit another person's emotions. That choice is where the danger often begins. When people think about intimate partner violence, they often imagine a sudden explosion, an argument that turns physical, a moment of rage that goes too far. In reality, many lethal cases follow a recognizable pattern. A controlling partner feels power slipping. A boundary is set. A breakup happens. The person who believes they are entitled to the other person's attention and loyalty experiences that boundary as humiliation. And humiliation, in the mind of someone who cannot tolerate losing control, can become something sharper. Natalie and Blake were no longer together, but their lives hadn't fully separated. They were part of the same friend group. Plans for the graduation trip had been made earlier. Social circles overlap in small towns, and breakups don't automatically create distance. Natalie did not disappear. She did not hide. She tried to keep peace in a group that still included her ex. For a healthy person, that's difficult, but possible. For someone who equates love with ownership, it can feel like a chance to regain what was taken. The trip to Myrtle Beach was a pressure cooker disguised as a vacation. When people imagine control, they picture commands. Don't go. Don't talk to him. You can't wear that. Sometimes it does sound like that. More often, it sounds softer, the tone of a wounded boyfriend who wants reassurance. Control can begin as a question that is really an accusation. Why didn't you answer? Who were you with? What were you talking about? It can take the form of rules that are framed as agreements. We don't keep secrets. We tell each other everything. We share passwords because we trust each other. To a teenager, those rules can feel like intimacy. To a controlling partner, they are a surveillance system. The more access you give, the more access is demanded. And if you resist, the resistance is treated as proof you are doing something wrong. In a long teenage relationship, Control can also become normal through repetition. Friends see jealousy and shrug. Parents see mood swings and assume it is youth. A person being controlled learns to manage the other person's emotions, to avoid arguments, to keep peace, to keep the group comfortable. The relationship becomes less about love and more about maintenance. This matters because it changes how a breakup is perceived. Natalie may have viewed the breakup as an end, but in a control-based dynamic, the controlling person often treats a breakup as temporary defiance, something to be negotiated, pressured, or punished away. The relationship is not over until the controlling person agrees it is over. That is why post-breakup contact can be dangerous. Shared friends, shared plans, shared spaces can become stages where control is tested again and again. Teen life is crowded in a way adult life often isn't. People share classes, sports, workplaces, and social circles. A couple can break up, but the group remains. Everyone tries to keep things normal because normal is comfortable. On a graduation trip, that crowded geometry becomes even tighter. People are sleeping under the same roof, sharing bathrooms, sharing meals, sharing rides. There is no go home and cool off. There is nowhere to disappear without becoming the subject of concern or gossip. If tension rises, the group feels it. That tightness can create two kinds of pressure. It can pressure a controlling person to perform calmness in public. And it can pressure the person being controlled to minimize conflict, because any scene changes the whole trip. So even if Natalie felt uneasy around Blake, she may have decided to keep things smooth. Even if friends sensed awkwardness, they may have told themselves it was temporary. This is how groups unintentionally protect the person most likely to explode, by prioritizing comfort over intervention. On June 6, 2023, the friends went out. They did what newly graduated teenagers do. They chased loud music and bright lights, and the thrill of being somewhere that felt bigger than home. Later accounts described a visit to the House of Blues in North Myrtle Beach. The details of drinks, songs, and conversations blur, because that is how nights like this are supposed to be remembered, imprecisely, as a collage of fun. But one detail mattered. Natalie was communicating with another boy, someone local. In a healthy breakup, seeing an ex texting someone new might sting, but it is also expected. It is proof that the world keeps moving. For a controlling partner, it can feel like betrayal, even when there is nothing left to betray. What matters is not the message itself, but what it represented. Natalie acting like a free person. At some point, Natalie left the group early and returned to the rental. She wasn't feeling well. Blake went with her. The rest of the friends stayed out longer, unaware that the most dangerous part of the trip had begun in a quiet room away from the music. What happened next was reconstructed by investigators through witness statements, physical evidence, and digital records. Even when people lie, timelines have ways of telling the truth. Phones go silent. Doors lock. Minutes pass. On paper, those lines look like narration. In an investigation, they become anchors. Records later helped narrow the critical window. Natalie's phone activity stopped at approximately 10:17 p.m. on June 6. Blake's phone activity also stopped at that same minute, then returned about 45 minutes later. Around 11:02 p.m., a message went out to his father that investigators viewed as an early admission of wrongdoing. These timestamps mattered because they did not depend on anyone's memory. They existed outside the emotional chaos of that night. The quiet of a phone is not just silence, it is a clue. It can indicate a device powered off, a battery removed, a person unable to respond, or a moment when someone chose to stop recording their life because something irreversible was unfolding. Inside the rental, behind a closed bedroom door, Natalie was killed by manual strangulation. Those two words, manual strangulation, are not just clinical language. They describe a method of killing that requires proximity and persistence. It is not a distant act. It is not quick. It demands that the attacker remain present as the victim struggles. It often leaves injuries that speak to sustained pressure. Medical experts frequently explain that manual strangulation typically takes minutes, not seconds, to become fatal. During those minutes, there are countless opportunities to stop. That is why strangulation is so significant in court. It undercuts the idea of accident. It argues against a fleeting impulse. It suggests sustained intent. Natalie fought for air. Her body did what bodies do. It resisted. The person killing her had to keep going. When it was over, Natalie was dead in a room that should have held laughter and selfies and exhaustion after a night out. Then came another decision point, one that reveals as much about motive as the killing itself. Help was not called immediately. Hours passed. A locked door remained locked. Friends in the house became uneasy. Some heard noises earlier, thuds, raised voices, a disturbance that didn't fit the vacation mood. They did not yet understand the scale of what was happening. Teenagers are not trained to interpret danger in relationships. They are trained to avoid drama. They are trained to assume that fights will burn out on their own. Many people, even adults, hesitate to intervene because they do not want to accuse someone unfairly, or make a situation worse, or cross a social boundary. The social boundary is the trap. By the morning of June 7th, the truth could not be contained behind a door anymore. A 911 call came in to Horry County Dispatch around 9 a.m. The call was not simply a request for medical help, it was a signal that the scene had already shifted into the realm of criminal investigation. The caller reported an unresponsive 18-year-old at a vacation rental on Maison Drive in Myrtle Beach. The voice on the line was panicked. They said they tried CPR. They said she was cold. The words suggested they already believed it was too late. Police and paramedics arrived to a scene that no group of teenagers should ever have to witness. Outside stood traumatized friends. Inside, in a bedroom, Natalie Martin was found dead. Investigators quickly recognized that this was not a medical emergency. The physical signs on Natalie's neck indicated strangulation. The room showed evidence consistent with a struggle, bedding disturbed, subtle disarray that did not match a peaceful night of sleep. The door had been locked. There was no obvious sign of forced entry, no indication of robbery, no clear reason to suspect an unknown outsider. The evidence pointed inward, toward someone Natalie knew. Among the friends was Blake Linkus. To investigators, he was not the X in an abstract sense. He was a person with opportunity, access, and motive, three pillars that shape early suspect selection. He had been with Natalie in the last hours of her life. He had been behind the locked door, and he had a relationship history that could explain why an argument might become violent. But investigations are built on proof, not assumptions. Detectives ask practical questions first. Where was everyone? When did people return to the rental? Who saw Natalie last? Who heard anything unusual? What time did the group notice the door was locked? What explanations were given through the night? Each answer was a thread that could be pulled against digital data and physical findings. He had injuries of his own, superficial stab wounds that investigators believed were self-inflicted. Such injuries can be staged as an attempted suicide, a way to redirect the narrative from "I hurt someone" to "I was overcome with grief." In many cases, self-harm after violence is both genuine despair and strategic performance. Human behavior is messy, motives can overlap, but investigators noted that Blake's wounds did not align with a desperate attempt to end his life. Witnesses said Blake had been alone in the locked room for many hours. That detail mattered. In homicide investigations, time alone with a body raises questions not only about what happened, but what was done afterward, the shaping of a story, the staging of a scene, the delay of discovery. As detectives processed the rental, they gathered fingerprints, DNA, and trace evidence. They documented the room with photographs. They analyzed patterns of blood related to Blake's injuries, looking for clues about when those injuries occurred. They sought to identify a timeline that could not be argued away. Digital forensics provided the breakthrough. Cell records and phone data helped establish the final window of Natalie's life. Messages and activity patterns suggested a moment when both phones went quiet and then one resumed. A text to Blake's father sent later that night would become one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the case. In it, Blake indicated he had screwed up, language that reads as immediate awareness of wrongdoing rather than confusion. Investigators also uncovered earlier communications that revealed Blake's mindset. Prior threatening or controlling messages suggested obsession and jealousy, even after the breakup. Friends described earlier violence, including an incident that escalated beyond a simple shove. The relationship history painted a picture that prosecutors would later argue was not about love, but about possession. This is the part that often confuses people. Many abusers do feel something they call love. They can be tender. They can be attentive. They can also be controlling, and in their minds the control is proof of love rather than proof of entitlement. They confuse devotion with dominance. When Natalie tried to live as a separate person, Blake experienced it as an attack. The investigation moved quickly. Blake was arrested and charged with murder on June 8, 2023. A confession would later come, but even confessions can contain strategies, admissions paired with justifications, facts paired with excuses, responsibility diluted by emotion. As the case entered the legal system, a decision was made that shocked many who followed it. Blake was granted bond. In the abstract, bond is not meant to be a judgment of guilt. It is meant to assess risk. The risk that the accused will flee, intimidate witnesses, or harm others. Courts often weigh age, prior record, community ties, and mental health evaluations. In many places, judges are encouraged to avoid pretrial detention unless there is a clear, documented reason. That framework can collide with the reality of intimate partner homicide, where the most important risk, the risk to the victim, has already become irreversible. Families left behind are asked to accept a process that looks forward while their grief is rooted in what is already done. The bond decision became part of the story not because it changed the evidence, but because it revealed how easily systems can underestimate violence when it comes from someone young, someone familiar, someone who does not fit the stereotype of dangerous. A judge set bond at $150,000, with conditions such as electronic monitoring and house arrest. Blake returned to his parents' home in Ohio while the case moved forward. For Natalie's family, this was more than a legal ruling. It was a second trauma. They were planning a funeral and watching the person accused of killing their daughter return home. The justice system is built on principles that protect the rights of the accused, and those principles matter. But when the accusation is supported by strong evidence, and when the act is brutal, the distance between legal logic and human pain becomes enormous. The months turned into nearly 2 years. Evidence was organized. Witnesses were interviewed. Lawyers negotiated. The slow machinery of court proceedings moved forward while Natalie's loved ones lived in the permanent after. In March 2025, Blake pleaded guilty to murder. There would be no trial, no jury weighing evidence in public. The guilty plea spared Natalie's family the ordeal of graphic testimony, but it also meant that many details would remain sealed behind legal process rather than exposed in open court. At sentencing, prosecutors emphasized what the method of killing revealed. Manual strangulation, the judge noted, is not momentary. It requires sustained effort. In such circumstances, a minimum sentence would not be appropriate. Blake was sentenced to 45 years in prison without the possibility of parole. In court, Blake spoke. He referred to Natalie as the love of my life. He said he failed to protect her. Those words are chilling, not because they are unusual, but because they are familiar in domestic violence cases. The language centers the perpetrator as a tragic figure, a protector who somehow could not save the person he harmed, as if the danger came from outside rather than from his own hands. This is one of the most insidious features of possessive violence. The abuser claims the role of guardian while acting as the threat. For a moment, it appeared the legal chapter was closed. Then, in December 2025, Blake filed a petition seeking post-conviction relief, arguing that what happened should not be classified as murder, that the conviction should be reduced. In other words, after pleading guilty, after accepting a sentence, he attempted to reshape the narrative. To Natalie's family, the petition was another reopening of grief. It forced attention back onto the case, back onto Blake's framing, back onto the argument that he did not mean what he did. The petition also revealed a psychological truth. Control does not always end when a relationship ends. It can continue through courts, through filings, through statements that reframe violence as misunderstanding. It is a way of maintaining influence over a story when influence over a person is no longer possible. The question many people ask in cases like this is, why didn't someone stop it? They mean well, but the question often carries an assumption that the danger was obvious. It rarely is. Teenage relationships can look intense even when they are healthy. Jealousy is often romanticized. Inexperience is treated as innocence. When young people show controlling behavior, adults may dismiss it as immaturity rather than a warning sign. Natalie's case demonstrates how quickly the stakes can rise. A breakup does not always create safety. Sometimes it triggers retaliation. Sometimes it exposes the most dangerous part of a controlling partner's identity, the belief that if they cannot have someone, no one can. What could have changed the outcome? It is impossible to know, but we can identify the places where the pattern showed itself. A relationship marked by jealousy, a need for control, threats or intimidation, a violent incident that should have been treated as a line crossed, a social environment that kept the couple in the same spaces even after a breakup, a trip that placed them together in an unfamiliar location, away from parents and school oversight, with alcohol and late hours and locked doors. None of these factors alone guarantee tragedy. Together, they create risk. Natalie's friends and family have been left with questions that do not have satisfying answers. They carry memories that now split into before and after. Her best friend, Brooklyn Farrell, later spoke publicly about turning grief into advocacy, telling others that abuse does not only happen in movies, that warning signs should be taken seriously. That kind of advocacy is both brave and heartbreaking because it asks survivors to educate the world using the wound that changed them. Natalie's father delivered statements that captured the pain of living in a system that moves slowly. He spoke about what was stolen, a future, a family life, milestones that now exist only in imagination. These are the true costs that cannot be measured by sentencing guidelines. In public conversations about cases like this, there is a tendency to focus on the perpetrator's pathology, mental health, diagnoses, personality traits, excuses that make the violence seem like an anomaly. Blake was reported to have an autism spectrum diagnosis, a fact that can provide context for social development but cannot explain away deliberate violence. Diagnoses do not commit crimes. People do. The more useful focus is the pattern, control, entitlement, escalation, and the lethal moment that follows when control collapses. If there is a lesson that can be spoken without exploiting Natalie's death, it is this. Love is not ownership. Jealousy is not devotion. Surveillance is not care. And a partner who treats your independence as a threat is not merely insecure, they may be dangerous. Natalie Martin should be in her early 20s now. She should be building a life, making mistakes, laughing at things that will not matter later, discovering what adulthood actually feels like. Instead, her story has become a warning. But warnings only work if we understand them. On Maison Drive, the sun rose the morning Natalie was found. Outside, the beach looked like a beach always looks. The ocean did what it always does. Vacation rentals stood quiet in daylight. The world did not pause. Inside one of those houses, a young woman's life had ended. The work left to the living is to see the pattern early enough to interrupt it, to take the small warnings seriously before they become headlines, to protect futures that have not yet been stolen. That is the only kind of ending this story can offer, not closure, but clarity.